Hello, friends. My name is Tawny. I am the owner of Wildwood Creative, and today I'm going to show you how to make this skirt. I love this skirt. It's so fun. It's got a flat front, elastic waist back. It has pockets, of course. It's nice and swishy. It's got a fun little leg slit, and it's super easy to make. So let's get started. And quick note, I had some technical issues making this tutorial. My mic wasn't on, so you're going to hear voiceover that does not match up with my lips. Just giving you a heads up, that's all. Okay, let's get going. First up, let's talk about the materials you will need for this project. I'm using this fun twill from Mind the Maker. It's nice and lightweight. You'll need about 1.5 to 2 yards of fabric and then a coordinating thread. You'll need some waistband elastic. I'm going to use this little scrap of sparkly elastic that I have, but any sort of waistband elastic will work. You'll need a measuring tape for measuring yourself. You will need either a rotary cutter or scissors for cutting your pieces out, and you'll need pins, seam ripper, basic sewing notions, some kind of pocket pattern piece. I'm using one from another pattern that I own. If you don't own a pattern with a pocket piece, you can find one online or just draw one yourself. And then a little bit of interfacing for our waistband. A hot ruler is going to be really useful if you have one. If you don't have one, I'll talk about tricks to do instead. And then a little safety pin for feeding the elastic through our waistband. First up, we need to measure ourselves. And it's a good idea to measure yourself before each project. Our bodies change over time, so always a good idea to check. And for this one, we're going to need a waist measurement. So just go ahead and measure right around where the waistband of the skirt is going to sit. And because it's elastic, it's naturally going to like cinch up to that smallest part of you at your waist. So go ahead, take that measurement. And when I do this, I like to take a deep breath in, let it out, and take that measurement just so I like breathing room in my clothes. Okay? Okay, so we got our waistband measurement. Next up, we need our hip measurement. So that's going to be the widest part of you. And this might be helpful to do in front of a mirror because you really want to make sure that the measuring tape is going straight. It's not, it's a little bit angled on me. I wasn't doing this in front of a mirror. But go ahead and take that measurement around the widest part of you. And then the last measurement we need is the length. That's going to be the waist down to where you want the skirt to go. This one you might need someone to help you. It's a little tricky to do it yourself, but I just kind of slid it down my leg and then measured where the end of that was to get the length measurement. So once you have all of your measurements, we are ready to figure out what size to cut our pieces to.
We have our measurements and now we are going to figure out how big to cut all of our pieces. When I first made this skirt, I copied it from a skirt I already had, so I just measured those pieces and added seam allowance. I went ahead and created these formulas so that way you can plug in your own measurements to figure out what size of pieces you need. So for our front waistband, we're going to take our waist measurement, divide it by 2, and add 3 inches for seam allowances. So I have 33.5 divided by 2 is 16.75 plus 3 is going to give me 19.75. That's how long the waistband is going to be. The back waistband, I'm taking that same waist measurement, divide by 2, so the 16.75. This time I am adding 12. The 12 is to give fullness in the back of the skirt. So that gives me 28.75. And then our waistband width. So this is how wide the waistband pieces will need to be. And this will be determined by the width of your elastic. I'm using 1.5 inch elastic. So times 2 because the waistband needs to fold over the elastic. That gives us 3. And then we're adding 1.25 inches for seam allowances and to have a little bit of room for the elastic. So that's going to give us 4.25. And now we know that our front waistband is going to be 19.75 by 4.25. Our back waistband is going to be 28.75 by 4.25. Next, we'll figure out the front panels. We are cutting 2 rectangles to sew together to leave open for that little leg slit. So for the front panel, I'm taking the back waistband measurement that I found, the 28.75, and dividing by 3. So 28.75 divided by 3 gives me 9.58. I'm just going to go ahead and round up to 10. And then I need to add an inch for seam allowances. So let me add that in here. The reason we're dividing by 3 is basically that's a good way to divide up that front panel is a third goes on the left and 2/3 goes on the right. So if we have 10 on the left from our 28.75, that would leave us with 18.75 on the right. I'm going to round up to 19. For this project, exact measurements aren't critical. I would say your waistband width, you do want to be pretty precise, but otherwise there's some flexibility because we'll be gathering and using elastic. So if you're a 1/4 inch difference, it's not really going to affect things too much. I am going to add a 1-inch seam allowance to each of these. So that's going to give me 11 inches for my front left panel. And then it'll be by the length that I determined, so by 27. And I'm going to add 2 inches and 1 inch for seam allowances. So we'll call it 30. So 11 by 30 for our front left panel, and then 20 by 30 for our front right panel. And then lastly, we have the back panel, which is really easy. We just take that back waistband measurement, 28.75 by our length of 30. And then we'll need 4 pocket pieces using our pattern. So this is how you can figure out how big you need to cut your pieces. I did update this portion of the tutorial to try to make it more clear and less confusing. So in the next steps, you may see me use some different numbers. That's simply because I adjusted these formulas to work a little bit better, but the same principles are going to apply. I just don't want you to be confused when you see different numbers in the next step.
In this step, I am mapping out where my pieces will go on my fabric. This will help you figure out how much fabric to get if you want to get the exact right amount of fabric. If you don't want to do this step, you can just get like 2 yards of fabric and you should be fine. If your measurements are quite a bit bigger, you might want to go up to 3. But if you do want to get just the right amount of fabric, this is a great way to do it. I'm using a dot grid notebook here, and I like this because then I can map everything out to scale. So each box on my grid equals 3 inches. So I am just taking the measurements that we got in the last step and mapping that out on my grid. So I've got the back panel in there, and then I've mapped out the 2 front panel pieces here. And I was able to squeeze these both onto a 60-inch width, depending on how long you want your skirt. You may be able to squeeze both panels from one width. If you are going for a longer skirt, you may have to get extra fabric to accommodate for that. But I've got both those front panels on there, and then next I am adding in the waistbands, which are the 4.25. And since my fabric is 60 inches wide, I'll be able to get both waistband pieces from one big long strip. And then the last thing I need are my pocket pieces. So I just measured the width of my pocket piece, which is 6.5 inches. So that's another little piece here I need for fabric. So that's accommodating room to cut out all of those pocket pieces. Appreciate my very detailed sketches of the pocket pieces here. But altogether, this came out to, I believe, 42 or 45 inches, which is like 1.25 yards. I had 1.5 yards of fabric, and it was a little close, I'll be honest, mostly because I did mess up on the pieces a little bit, which I will show you. But this is a good way to figure out how much fabric you need. Personally, I always get extra because I just know myself and know that I'm probably going to mess up and cut something wrong. So 2 yards is about a good rule of thumb for fabric. And if you want to get precise, you can do this little step of mapping everything out in your notebook. Okay, we're ready to start cutting our pieces. And a quick note here, you absolutely want to pre-wash your fabric before you start working with it. If any shrinking happens, we want that to happen before we make our final garment. It would suck to make a garment and then wash it and have it not fit anymore. I like to just serge my fabric ends together into one big tube and then I throw it through the wash. I wash my fabric, however, I intend to wash the completed garment, which for me is typically a good old wash and dry. I'm not much for line drying. That's just me. But here we are. We have our fabric washed, ready to go. Mine came out of the dryer pretty neat, so I didn't end up ironing it. If you've got some really deep creases, you'll probably want to take a second and iron your fabric. And then as far as cutting goes, you have a few options. This is a really nice woven, and the cool things with wovens is you can actually just tear them. So I am snipping in about an inch with my scissors, and then I'm just going to tear that fabric. And I'm really sad my mic wasn't working because this noise is so satisfying. Anyways, you'll just have to enjoy the visual. So I am tearing that fabric. It will always tear straight along the grain line, which is nice. That makes it really easy to get your pieces exactly straight. It does give you this kind of ripply edge and a lot of little stringies. So if you don't want to deal with all of that, you can use a rotary cutter and a mat or scissors to cut out your fabric. For that situation, I find it's easiest to lay it out on the floor or a really big table so I can measure and then cut out my pieces. So I've got my reference here from my little sketch that I made so I can figure out how to get all of my pieces. And I'm going to start with that back panel. I usually start with my biggest pieces first. That's just kind of how I work. But I am grabbing my measuring tape and then I'm just going to measure out that length I need for my back panel. So I'm just using my measuring tape, measuring across. Once I find my measurement, I add a quarter of an inch when I tear just because of that kind of rippled edge that happens. It's also a good idea to test your fabric before you tear. Some fabrics snag really bad when you tear them, so just check before you do this. I then snipped off that selvage edge and then measured the other length that I needed, snipped again, and tore again. I really like tearing all my pieces, but it may not be for you. You do what's best for you. And then a good tip as well is label your pieces. So I put this nice little label right at the top center of that piece so I know that it's the top center. I love using this Kylie in the Machine label tape. We carry this at the shop. It's super, super handy. I label all of my fabric in my stash with it as well. So I'm just going to continue tearing fabric until I get all of the pieces that I need. For the pocket pieces, be sure to fold your fabric over. We need pairs of pocket pieces, so we don't want them to all be identical. We want them to be mirror images of each other. And I'm just using my rotary cutter here to cut out this piece. If you don't have a rotary cutter, you can just pin your pattern piece to the fabric and use scissors to cut around it. So now I have all of my pieces, and don't forget to cut your interfacing. I almost forgot to cut out my interfacing. So that's what I have here. And for interfacing, what you will need is your front waistband measurement, but we just need basically the middle of the waistband. I am taking an inch off of the length and an inch off of the width, so that way my interfacing will not end up in my seam allowances. I just think this makes for less bulky seam allowances. I mostly do this because other patterns I have made have done it this way. So I have my measurement for my interfacing and I'm going to get that cut out as well. For that, I'm just using my mat rotary cutter and ruler, but again, you could use scissors if needed. All right, we have all of our pieces cut out and we are ready to start sewing. We are starting with our two front panels. You can put the slit on either side. It's totally up to you. Just whichever way you orient the panels is where the slit will end up. But we need to figure out how high we want that slit to be. So on my skirt, I came down 11 inches from the waistband, and that gave me like upper to mid thigh leg slit, so adjust accordingly to your comfort level. But I measured down on each piece and then matched those up at the pin and then am pinning those together. I did a double pin where the slit is going to stop to give myself a like, hey, stop sewing here signal. Anyways, we are sewing. I'm sewing this at a 1/2 inch, but future Tawny is going to recommend that you actually use 5/8 of an inch. It's going to make the step after this a lot easier. but I am starting with a backstitching right to the edge, and then just sewing these together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, even though what you're looking at is a 1/2 inch. So keep sewing, and then when you get to that double pin marker, stop with your needle down, and I am turning my stitch length up as high as it will go. I'm going all the way up to a 5 on my machine. This is what's called a basting stitch. So this is going to temporarily hold these panels together so we can finish them, and then once we're done, we'll seam rip them apart for our nice little leg slit. For our next step, we're headed to the ironing board. So go ahead and press that seam open that you just sewed. And this is where having that little bit bigger of seam allowance is going to make this step a little bit easier for you. So what we're doing to get a nice clean finish is we're going to tuck the edge of this under and glue baste it in place, and then we'll come back and top stitch from the front. So I'm just pressing it first, and then I'm going to go back in with just a tiny little bead of good old-fashioned Elmer's school glue. And I'll go back and press that in place. School glue is like my favorite sewing notion. I use it all the time. I think it's a must-have for your sewing room. But yeah, just press that in place. Do that on both sides. And now we are ready to top stitch this down. I like to use the seam line as my guide, and we want to make sure we're catching that on the back. So I lower my foot to be even with that seam line, and then I just move my needle over all the way to the left. And this makes it really easy to just go right along that seam line and top stitch this in place. So go ahead and top stitch all the way down one side, and then when you get to the end, flip it around and go all the way back down the other side. So here we are, and you can see we've got a really nice looking top stitch from the front and the back, and it caught that on the back. And then I like to add a bar tack to secure this so the leg slit doesn't come open any more than it should. So if you kind of gently pull the fabric apart, you should be able to see the point where we switched to the basting stitch. My machine has a bar tack in the buttonhole section. If yours does not, you can just use a zigzag stitch. Just set your length to 0 and your width as wide as it will go. And then you'll get a nice little bar tack that will stop your leg slit from coming open any more than you want it to.
Okay, I've got my seam ripper, and then I'm just going in and opening up this seam to where we placed that bar tack. So this is our skirt slit all done. And this is also a good reminder that your seam rippers need to be replaced every once in a while. This one has gotten pretty dull, and in true fashion, I cannot find my new sharp one. So I'm using this dull seam ripper. But if you're struggling to seam rip, it might be because it's dull and it's time to replace it. And then once you've done that, just go back through and pull out all of those little threads. All right, we have our front panel ready to go. Our next step is adding our pockets. And for this, I like to add my pockets pretty much right at the top of my skirt. So I am going to go here, and then I have to account for that 1/2 inch of seam allowance.
Future Tawny here to let you know you do not need to account for that. The pocket has a top edge. You should line that up with the top edge of your skirt piece.
And then you will grab a pocket and place it right sides together with the straight edge at the top of that 1/2 inch mark, and then just lined up with the straight edge here. So this is the front panel. So I'm going to pin this pocket here, and then I'm going to stitch it on at my 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to do that for both sides of the front panel and both sides of the back panel. I missed a step, but I'll be sure to put this in the right order for you in the tutorial. Before we press and edge stitch our pockets, we need to finish just this little edge right here where the pocket is. There's a lot of different ways to finish seams. You can use a serger, a zigzag stitch. For me, I'm going to be using a overlocking stitch on my machine. It's stitch number 3, and I switch out to this different foot. But I really like this method. You just line up the edge with this little metal bar, and then it runs a overlocking stitch right over the edge. And I'm only going just past the pocket. We'll finish this seam later once we have the front and back panel sewn together. You can see where I've stitched the pocket on at the 1/2 inch seam allowance. And my next step is to press all of these away from the skirt. And then we're going to go back in and do what's called edge stitching. So I'm going to go and sew as close to this edge as I can. This is just going to make it so that the pocket lining stays inside of the pocket when I'm wearing the skirt. I'm going to do this for all 4 pocket pieces. I will press them away from the skirt and then go in and do that line of edge stitching about an 1/8 inch away from this seam line here. For the edge stitching, I used the same trick where I just moved my needle all the way to the left as far as it would go, and then I'm using this seam line as my guide to stitch that in place. Here is what your edge stitching should look like, and then we have the finished edge on the back. We have edge stitched all of our pockets in place, and now we are ready to sew the back panel to the front panel of our skirt. We will match these up right sides together, and I like to leave the labels on still at this point just to make things easy. But we'll go ahead and line them up along the sides. So we're going to pin around the top of the pocket. We'll go around the curve of the pocket. When I get to this point here, I like to come in and backstitch and then pivot and backstitch. This point of the pocket tends to see a lot of stress, so I like to just add some backstitching in there to give it a little bit more strength. But I'm just lining up these 2 side seams. I'm going to pin them together all the way around and then stitch together at my 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to start with some back stitches all the way to the edge and then just continue sewing around at that 1/2 inch seam allowance. And get here where I'm turning onto the pocket. I'll keep the needle down, lift the foot, and pivot so I can sew right along the top of that pocket. And then again, I'm stopping about a 1/2 inch away, needle down, lift the foot, and pivot. Just kind of gently ease your fabric around that curve. All right, and here is where I'm going to add in some of those back stitches. So I'm coming just past that stitch line. I'm going to back stitch. This time I'll keep my needle down, pivot. I'll go forward 3 and back 3. That's just going to help keep that pocket nice and secure. We've got our 2 pieces sewn together, and now we need to finish the raw edges of these pieces. You can use that overlocking stitch that we showed you earlier. You can use a zigzag stitch. I'm going to be using a serger and just running all the way around the edges on both sides. Here's what that serged edge looks like. I love a serger. It gives a really nice, clean finish to your projects. Certainly not necessary, but if you make a lot of garments, I definitely think they're worth the investment. So we've got that done, and now we need to sew our front waistband and our back waistband together at the side seams. So I'm just going to pair these up right sides together and sew them together on the 2 short seams using our 1/2 inch seam allowance. I did miss a step there again. So we needed to apply our interfacing before we did that. But if you also forgot, that's okay. We can do it now. So we are going to center this piece of interfacing right in the middle of this front waistband piece. So either side, we have our seam allowance of where it'll be getting sewn to the skirt, and we've got the interfacing just in the middle. For applying interfacing, the instructions will tell you to use a damp pressing cloth. This will keep you from scorching your fabric. And also, when the cloth is dry, that's when you know the interfacing glue is all adhered. I don't do that. I'm going to be 100% honest with you. I don't do that. I just go straight in with my iron. I do like to start in the middle and work my way out because sometimes interfacing will kind of shrink up and ripple a little bit. So this can help avoid that. But basically, just picking up, setting down your iron along that piece of interfacing, and then you can kind of pull and see if it's stuck and if there's anywhere you need to hit it again with the iron. But there we go. We've got that piece of interfacing on. We've got our two pieces sewn together. We've got that interfacing on, and we are going to now press these side seams open. This is going to help reduce the bulk when we go to fold our waistband in half. I've got those seams pressed open, and now we are going to do what's called pre-pressing our waistband. This is just going to make it easier when we go to sew things together later, but we're going to press it in half, wrong sides together, like this. So make your way all the way around, pressing it in half. We've got that waistband pressed in half, and the next thing we're going to do is press our seam allowances on either side of the waistband. So I'm opening this up and grabbing my hemming tool. This is called a hot hemmer or a hot ruler. So one side I am going to press at the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm just pulling that edge of the fabric up to where it hits the 1/2 inch line on my hot ruler. If you don't have one of these, you can take a piece of cardstock or cereal box cardboard and just draw that 1/2 inch line and use that instead. So I'm going to make my way all the way around this side, pressing that bottom edge up at a 1/2 inch. I pressed one side under a 1/2 inch, and now I'm going to go to the opposite side, and I'm actually going to do this one a little shorter at just about a 1/4 inch, somewhere between like a 1/4 and I guess that'd be 3/8. The reason we're doing this is because we're going to sew the waistband to the skirt at the 1/2 inch, and then it'll wrap around the elastic towards the inside of the skirt, and we're going to top stitch it down from the front. And we want the inside to extend just past the front. So if we look at this, this is how it's going to be once it's on our skirt. We need that to extend past because we'll go in and we'll stitch in the ditch right here. So we want that to extend past so we can catch it when we go to do that stitch in the ditch from the front. So 1/2 inch on one side and just about a 1/4 inch on the other. Press it all the way around. We've got our pre-pressed waistband and our skirt body. And you'll notice our front panel is quite a bit wider than the length of our front waistband. To make this fit here, we need to gather this. What we're going to do is run 2 lines of basting stitches. So again, that is just our longest stitch length. We'll leave nice long thread tails. We'll run 2 lines along the top, and then when we pull on the bobbin thread, we'll be able to gather this fabric up and shrink it down to fit with our waistband here. I have turned the stitch length on my machine up to 5. And I'm going to start by pulling out some nice long thread tails. So I'm pulling up that bobbin thread and giving myself a nice long tail. And I will start sewing right here at the edge of the front skirt piece. Be sure not to backstitch at this stage. And I'm going to run my first line of stitching at about 3/8 of an inch, which is just the edge of my machine foot. Stop when you get to the edge of that piece, lift your foot, and then pull out nice long tails and snip. For our second row of basting stitches, we're going to go right next to that row we just did in between the edge of the fabric and the row of stitches we just made. And again, stopping and leaving nice long tails. Before gathering, I like to mark the center of each piece just so that when I go to gather this, I can make sure that all of my gathers are evenly distributed. So I will just fold this in half to find the center, And I'm just using a little chalk line marking tool here to mark a line, and that's not showing up very well actually. So I think I'll switch and use a little clip and put that right there at the center, and then I'll find the middle between the center and the edge. We'll put another one there. And then again from this edge to that clip. So we've basically just divided it up evenly across the top there. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the front waistband piece. And make sure, fold those edges back how you had them pressed, and make sure you're using the right side. We want the edge that's a little bit longer to go on the inside of the skirt. So the shorter edge is the one that we're going to be sewing to the skirt. So I'm using this edge that we pressed at a 1/2 inch. And again, I am lining it up, folding in half, putting a little clip. So now when I go to gather, I am just grabbing the back threads, these two here, and pulling on those. And you'll see the fabric will start to gather. And it doesn't really want to go past that clip, so I'm going to switch out that clip for something else. This is all part of the sewing process. There's a lot of just trial and error, figuring things out. So I'm going to try this chalk line again. It's just not showing up very well. Let me see if I can find a different marking tool. I just went with pins and I just kind of wove them into the fabric, so hopefully they do not fall out as we're doing this process. But again, we are just grabbing those back threads and then kind of gathering the fabric up. I like to gather smaller than the piece I'm attaching to, and then I can kind of spread it out to fit. There's a lot of different ways to do this. I've seen people zigzag over dental floss. I think there's settings you can do with tension on your machine to make gathers. So there's a lot of different methods, and I've always encouraged folks to try all the different things. You never know what's going to work for you, because what works for you might not work for someone else, and what works for someone else might not work for you. Yeah. So I've got this about the same length as my front waistband piece, and then I'm just gonna try to spread these out so they're nice and even. Don't get too picky with it. No one's really gonna notice once you're wearing it. But all right, and then I'm just gonna match up each pin with where I placed that clip. And then matching up the side seams. And for this, we are going to have the pocket, because it'll be easier if the pocket is hanging in the front. So we're going to make that side seam with the pocket go towards the front, and that'll help your pocket hang in the right direction and hopefully make it easier to find your pockets when you need to go to put stuff in them. And then once you have each little section done, you can kind of stretch things out to where they fit, and then just go back in with a bunch more pins to secure everything. I'm going to continue pinning each little section along the front here, and then I'll finish by just pinning the back waistband to the back panel all the way around. I've got my waistband pinned to the skirt, and I'm going to sew this all the way around at a 1/2 inch, doing my best to stitch right in the crease that I made earlier. Our waistband is on, and look at our beautiful gathers on the front of our skirt. A couple things to note: if any of your basting stitches are showing on the front, go ahead and pull those out. I tend to just leave mine in since they are going to get encased in the waistband. I don't really worry about it. But now we are going to come in and press this. We want to press this seam allowance up into the waistband. So I'm going to go all the way around, just giving this a good press. And I'm doing my best to kind of keep the iron on this edge so I don't lose that crease that I pressed earlier. I got that all pressed nice. And now I'm going to go back and press the waistband in place. This is where having that pre-pressed waistband makes this job a little bit easier, so things just fall into place. A couple things to note: the pocket that I used has this straight top, and that is so that you can sew the top of that pocket bag into the waistband and helps it kind of stay up when you put things in your pocket. So I'm just going to make sure that makes its way up. And then I'm back in with my glue, just running a little bead of glue just inside that stitch line where I sewed the waistband to the skirt. When I come in and fold this over, I want to make sure that it goes past that stitch line. Just like I showed you before, where we're going to be going in and top stitching from the front side, we want to make sure that it's going to catch this fabric on the back. So as I go around, I'm just making sure that this folded edge goes past that stitch line. And I'm going to make my way around, doing this all the way around the skirt, but I am going to leave about a 2 to 3 inch opening at the sides. So right here, I'm going to leave about this much space open. That's where we're going to insert our waistband elastic. Here's what the gap on the side looks like. So I've tacked it to here and to here, and then I've left this little space here open. This is how we're going to insert the elastic into the back. Quick note that if you want to add any sort of little label to your project, I love these little labels from Kylie and the Machine. We have them at the shop. Now is the time to do that. I typically forget and then it's too late. So I'm feeling pretty good about myself that I remembered this time. So I'm just setting that just inside the seam allowance, making sure it sticks out. There we go. Something like that. So if you're going to use a label, don't forget. We are back at the machine and ready to top stitch our waistband in place. As a reminder, we left this opening for our elastic, so I'm going to start my top stitching right about here. To start our top stitching, I've pulled up my bobbin thread so I get really nice clean stitches from both sides. And then for stitching the ditch, I just kind of watch this seam line feed right in between the two little skis on the front of my sewing foot. And here we go. I've also turned my machine speed down by about half. I find this helps me get a better looking stitch in the ditch. As I approach this side, remember we want to leave this open, so I'm going to stop right about here. And I'm just going to do one back stitch and snip my thread there. And then I'm going to skip over that opening that I want to leave and jump over to here and pick up my stitch in the ditch. We've created this channel for our elastic to go in. So now we need to put the elastic in our skirt. And I like to start by actually stitching it down on the side here. So I'm just going to kind of tuck it in to the side and fold that over. So I want it to line up right with that side seam. And then I'll fold this back over and do my best to make sure that it is going straight. Let's see if I can get that a little bit better. This part is a little finicky and tricky.
But just do your best to get it in there and get it straight. Once you've got it in position, just use a couple of pins to pin that in place. And then we're going to sew a straight line right down. I'm actually going to do two lines right next to each other, and this is going to secure the elastic in place. Here you can see those two lines of stitching. I did back stitch on both ends and pull up the bobbin thread to get really clean lines of stitching. Now we need to grab that safety pin. We're going to attach that to the end of our elastic and feed it through the channel opening in the skirt. So just kind of pass the safety pin back and forth between your two hands and work its way through that channel. Be careful not to twist the elastic as you do this. Try your best to keep it nice and flat. but just go ahead and feed it through the skirt. And then once you come out at the other side, we will pin that elastic in place. And then we are going to do a test fit once you've got that elastic pinned in place. And once you've got that in place, I do like to go ahead and just kind of stretch the fabric to try to get it distributed evenly across the elastic. So just kind of stretch it, slide it along, get it looking good. And now we are ready to check the fit. So with that elastic in place where it was, the skirt was pretty loose. So I'm undoing that safety pin, grabbing the elastic from the inside, and then just pulling it tight until I feel like I have a good fit and I like how it's feeling. I do suggest going just a tad tighter than you think. We're going to add some anchoring stitches later, and that stretches out the elastic a little bit. And then once you feel like you've got it in a good place, you do want to check and make sure that you're still able to slip the skirt over your hips and back up. So make sure you can still get it on and off, but once you feel like it's in a good place, go ahead, put that safety pin back in to secure it. Look at that, we've almost got a skirt. And once you've got that elastic situation figured out, go ahead, pin it in place and do the same 2 lines of stitching that we did on the other side to secure it. So there's those 2 lines of stitching.
We need to close up that opening where we put the elastic. So I've gone back in with my glue just to tack that all in place and hitting it with my iron really quick to help set it. This may get a little wonky here, but don't worry, it's the inside of your skirt. No one's gonna see it. The only thing that matters is that everything's secured and all of our raw edges are encased. So I've got that tacked down. So now I'm ready to go top stitch. I'm going to start just past where I left off, top stitch along here and go just past here to finish encasing that elastic all the way. There's that top stitching. So everything's secured now. And then the last thing I like to do up here is I give this a nice good stretch, try to stretch it all the way out and get that fabric spaced evenly. And then as it comes back together, I go into the middle and I like to run just a straight line of stitching in a couple of places. This just keeps the elastic. I can already feel the elastic has started to kind of fold over on itself, or if you've ever had like a pair of pajamas or something where the elastic flips over and gets all bunchy. I hate that. So what we're going to do is I'm finding the center here. I'm getting that elastic nice and flat. And I'm just going to put a couple of pins here. I'm just going to run 1 line of stitching here that will hold the elastic flat in place. And then I'll do the same thing here and the same thing here just to keep that elastic from turning and bunching up. I have 3 lines of stitching and those are working great to keep that elastic nice and flat and in place. And we are ready for our final step, which is hemming our skirt. So now is a good time to try it on again and make sure you like the length. I'm pretty happy with mine. I did notice I somehow my front panels ended up just a little bit shorter than my back panel. You know, it happens. So I am going to go back to my trusty scissors and just snip right there and then tear this back panel to where it now matches the length of my front panels. And now we're going to move over to the ironing board to press our hems and get ready for our final line of stitching. I'm going to be using my hot ruler again, and I like the look of a little bit bigger hem, so I am coming up 1 inch. I'm going to press that, and then I'm going to fold it over a second time. And I just really like the look of that, but you can do your hem however you would like. So I'm giving that a good press, and then I'll fold it a second time and press again. I'm pressing this seam towards the front because if you remember, we flipped our pocket to go towards the front. And then a good little trick for these little areas where you have a little bit of a bulkier seam is you can snip right into the seam, being careful not to stitch through your or snip through your seam line. And then we'll fold this piece over. So that way when we go to fold this piece up and over again, we don't have a bunch of bulk right in that one spot. And then again, I'm using my Elmer's glue. I find that with hems, if I just use pins, they tend to get kind of ripply as I go around. So I really like the Elmer's glue here to keep everything nice and flat. It definitely helps when your glue actually comes out of the bottle. So let's see. There we go. And then on the end here, I tuck this little, slide this over, tuck this little corner piece kind of in before I fold it up to make sure it doesn't stick out. And then going with my iron and just heat setting that. And I'm going to make my way all the way around the skirt, getting that ready for our final line of stitching. We're almost done. Jumping in real quick to mention that I know I showed you the whole process on that one end, but it is easier if you go all the way around, pressing at your 1 inch and then go back around with the second press and the glue. We are ready for our final line of stitching our hem. And for this, I want to make sure that I'm catching where we folded over on the back and that I'm keeping an even line here. So I'm going to get this kind of lined up under my needle where I want it. So I'm kind of feeling with my fingers where that edge is, making sure the needle's going to catch. I'll lower my foot down and then I use a little seam guide. So I'm just going to stick that down right on the edge there, and then I'm going to draw up my bobbin thread. I'll back stitch right to the edge, and then here we go. We have our finished skirt. Here it is. And I did kind of lie to you. While that was our last stitch line, it's not our last step. Our last step is going through and trimming off all of our threads. And you may be better than me, and maybe you did this as you were going and you don't have a ton of threads to trim. I'm really bad at being tidy as I go. So I always have a ton of threads to trim when I get to the end of a project. I'm going to go ahead and get all my threads trimmed, and then we'll go take a look at our final skirt.
Here it is, all done. I love it. I'm so excited. I hope this tutorial was helpful for you. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to our channel. And if you make this skirt, please tag us at Wildwood Creative so we can see it. I would love to see your skirt.